All right, everyone, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into how those ones and O's actually get moving.
Transmission fundamentals, we're talking the nuts and bolts of how data gets from point A to point B.
And heads up, we're assuming you've got the basics down, so get ready to go deeper.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll have a rock-solid grasp on how all those signals and wires actually enable the systems you'll be building.
Okay, so let's jump right in. How about quick definition? When we say transmission, we're talking about sending signals, and I mean signals carrying crucial data.
Right, and it all boils down to this fundamental interaction between a transmitter, the medium the signal travels through, and the receiver.
Kind of like a network itself. When you think
Yeah.
about it, you've got a source, the paths, and the destination, and just like networks.
Exactly. That choice of transmission medium, how it gets there, it's huge. It impacts everything.
For sure. So we've got what our source material calls guided media. Think your trusty copper wires or those fiber optic cables everyone's raving about.
The key there is that they provide a physical path.
Right, a direct line. Then there's unguided media, where we're basically letting our signal fly free as electromagnetic waves.
Radio waves for your broadcasts, microwaves for your Wi-Fi, even those infrared signals your TV remote loves to use.
And each of these has their own pros and cons, right? Like fiber optic is great for speed and long distances, but radio is the way to go for covering a large area.
Exactly. You got to pick the right tool for the job, always.
Makes sense. Now, about those signals themselves, the actual information carriers. Two main types here, good old analog, and then there's digital.
Analog signal, it's all about that continuous wave. Imagine a smoothly changing voltage.
Or even those sound waves from a musical instrument, that's still analog, right?
It is. Still around even in this digital age.
Right.
AM/FM radio, that's all analog. But for your computers and smartphones, it's the world of digital.
Discrete values, just those zeros and ones.
Can't forget about bandwidth. That range of frequencies a transmission medium can handle impacts how much data we can actually send every second.
So higher bandwidth means?
More data can flow through. It's like upgrading from a single-lane road to a massive multi-lane highway, all for your data.
Nice. Speaking of, that makes me think of baseband versus broadband transmission. What's the difference again?
Think of baseband as that dedicated lane for one single data signal. Simple, efficient for short distances, it's what you see with most Ethernet connections.
So broadband is more like?
Dividing that data highway into multiple lanes, allowing several signals to share the same channel.
By using different frequency ranges. Clever.
Exactly. And that's how we get cable TV, DSL, and a ton of technologies that let us do multiple things at once.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. We've got our media types, our signals, and an idea of how much data we can push through. But how do we actually analyze these signals?
Time to get visual. We're talking about the time domain and the frequency domain.
I'm intrigued. Walk me through it.
Okay, so the time domain is all about how a signal's intensity changes over, well, time. You're essentially plotting the voltage of a signal on a graph.
And what would we see for our different signal types?
With analog, you'd see those smooth, continuous variations we talked about. But for digital signals, with their abrupt jumps between 0 and 1, it'd look like a series of square pulses.
So it's like the difference between drawing a gentle curve versus a staircase, both showing change, but in totally different ways.
Love that analogy. And within these signals, we often see these repeating patterns, periodic signals we call them, like the steady hum of a tuning fork. Then there are aperiodic signals, which have no predictable repetition, like human speech.
To break these signals down even further, we can use things like amplitude, frequency, and phase.
Right, like a signal's vital signs. Amplitude tells us the signal's strength, frequency tells us how many cycles happen per second, and then there's phase, which indicates where a specific point in a signal cycle is.
And these are important because
they directly impact how a signal behaves and how it interacts with, say, the transmission medium. It's fundamental stuff.
But there's another layer to this, isn't there?
You're right. Understanding the time domain is important, but to really unlock what's going on with signals, we need to look at the frequency domain.
Okay, so what's so special about this frequency domain?
Think of it this way. Any signal, no matter how complex, can be broken down into a bunch of simpler signals, all with different frequencies.
So it's sort of deconstructing a signal, like if you took apart a musical chord and listened to each note.
Exactly. And this recipe of frequencies, we call that the signal spectrum. And that spectrum, that's where we can see the signal's bandwidth, the range of frequencies it takes up.
So a wider bandwidth would mean more ingredients in its recipe. More information.
You got it. It's like having a bigger vocabulary to express yourself with. And this is where things get interesting because then we start talking about how much information we can actually get through a channel.
Right, and that's where we bump up against some fundamental limits.
Yeah.
Like, how fast can data really go?
Are we talking theoretical limits here or real-world stuff?
A bit of both, actually. You've got Nyquist bandwidth, and then there's Shannon capacity. Two key concepts. Okay, so break those down for me.
So Nyquist, that's like our ideal scenario. A perfect channel, no noise whatsoever. Your signal arrives exactly how you sent it, zero interference.
The dream.
Right. And in this perfect world, Nyquist tells us the absolute max data rate we can hit based on the channel's bandwidth and the number of signaling levels.
Hold on. Signaling levels? Back up a sec. What are those again?
Good point. Think of it like this. With each pulse of our signal, we can send one value, right? But what if we could squeeze more than one value in each pulse? That's where those signaling levels come in.
Okay. So instead of just on or off, we could have like multiple levels of on.
Exactly. By using different voltage levels or even phase shifts within each pulse, we can pack more information into every single signal, like having a larger alphabet, right?
More symbols to work with. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So more signaling levels mean a higher data rate, according to Nyquist. But this is all still that perfect world scenario, yeah.
Exactly. And sadly, we don't live in a perfect world.
Nope. Noise is always going to be a thing.
Always. And that's where Shannon steps in Shannon's capacity formula. This one factors in that inevitable noise in real-world channels.
So more realistic.
Way more. It basically says, look, even with unlimited bandwidth, there's still a limit to how much data we can reliably send because of that noise.
So it's like a reality check?
Exactly. And it all comes down to the signal-to-noise ratio.
Mm-hmm.
How strong is the signal compared to the noise?
Right, like trying to have a conversation at a rock concert.
Perfect example. The louder the music, the harder it is to hear anything else. And that's SNR in a nutshell.
So higher SNR means a clearer signal, which means faster data.
You got it. But here's the catch with Shannon. It's still a theoretical maximum.
Yeah.
In reality, actually reaching that maximum, super difficult.
There's more to it than just bandwidth and noise then.
Always. You've got interference from other signals, limitations in those error correction codes, even overhead from communication protocols all eating into that data rate.
Like trying to pour a gallon of water through a leaky pipe. You're never going to get it all through.
Love it. And that's why engineers are always coming up with new tricks, better error correction, new modulation schemes, anything to squeeze more performance out.
A constant battle for more speed. So even with those limits, we've gotten pretty good at using our bandwidth, right? And that's where multiplexing comes in.
Ah, multiplexing. All about efficiency. This is about transmitting multiple signals over a single medium, like adding more lanes to our data highway.
So we're sharing resources instead of giving each signal its own lane. Smart.
Right. And the two big players here are frequency division multiplexing, FDM, and time division multiplexing, TDM.
Okay, so how do those work?
With FDM, think of it like assigning each signal its own little frequency range, like its own lane on the highway. As long as everyone stays in their lane, no interference.
Like radio stations broadcasting on different frequencies, right?
Yeah.
They all use the same airwaves, but no one's stepping on anyone else's toes.
Nailed it. Now, TDM, it's more like taking turns. Each signal gets its own dedicated time slot on the channel, a perfectly synchronized dance.
So they don't bump into each other?
Exactly. And these techniques are everywhere. Cable TV, your internet connection, even your smartphone, it's all multiplexing, making sure those bits and bytes flow smoothly.
So we've covered how we analyze signals, some limitations to keep in mind, and ways we've gotten around those limits. Now let's dig into those different media types again.
Right. Remember those two categories? Guided and unguided media. Guided media, that's all about having that physical path, the cables that carry our data.
So that's our copper wires and fiber optic cables we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Copper, that's been the workhorse for ages. Inexpensive, easy to install. You still see it everywhere for telephones and Ethernet in homes and offices.
So copper has been the go-to for a while, but fiber optic seems to be taking over. What makes it so special?
Fiber optic cables are like, well, imagine the superhighways of the data world, right? Instead of electrical signals, they're using pulses of light. And these pulses travel through these incredibly thin strands of glass or plastic fibers.
So we're talking about sending data at, like, the speed of light. That's wild.
Yeah, it is. And that's why you see fiber optics for all those high-speed, long-distance connections that power, well, everything, the internet. Handling those massive amounts of data, it needs that speed.
And what makes it so much faster?
They offer incredible bandwidth, for one. Plus, they're not affected by electromagnetic interference. That's huge. Oh, and the signal doesn't degrade as much over those long distances, which is another big win.
Sounds like a pretty clear winner for anything high performance.
It definitely has its advantages, especially as we keep wanting more and more speed. But copper is still around for a reason. Especially for shorter connections where it's just easier and cheaper to install, it does the job.
It's all about choosing the right tool, as always. Which brings us to that other side of the coin, unguided media. Now things get really interesting. No physical connections, just signals flying through the air.
Exactly. The world of electromagnetic waves, we're talking radio waves, which, let's be real, they're everywhere. Your car radio, your Wi-Fi, all using radio waves.
They're great for broadcasting over long distances,
But they're definitely susceptible to interference, and the bandwidth can be a limiting factor.
Right. And then there are microwaves, which always makes me think of heating up leftovers.
Well, they can do that, but they can also carry a ton of data. They operate at even higher frequencies than radio waves, so we're talking even higher bandwidths. Satellite communication, cellular networks, they all use microwaves.
And last but not least, infrared. The invisible waves that power things like TV remotes, right?
You got it. Short-range communication is where infrared shines. Data transfers between devices controlling your TV. It's very directional, which can be good or bad depending on what you're doing.
So many different ways to send data. It's amazing to think about how all these technologies have shaped how we live and how fast they keep changing.
I know, it's incredible. And as we move toward a world that's even more reliant on instant communication and super fast data, these demands are only going to increase.
We're going to need even faster, more reliable transmission technologies.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up, let's sum up what we've learned for those future computer scientists out there.
What are the key takeaways?
First and foremost, data transmission. It's the backbone of our interconnected world. It's what makes everything work, from a text message to a video call.
It's like the circulatory system of the digital age. Vital.
Well said. And understanding how it all works, those different types of media, what signals are, the limits of bandwidth and noise, it's essential knowledge.
It's about knowing what's possible, where the limits are, and then figuring out how to push those boundaries to build something new.
Exactly. And as you all dive deeper into computer science, remember that the quest for better, faster, more efficient ways to transmit data, that never ends.
There's always a new challenge, something new to invent.
Exactly. Embrace those challenges. Never stop being curious. The future of communication depends on it.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into the amazing world of transmission fundamentals. We hope you enjoyed the ride. Until next time, keep those curiosity circuits firing.